Primus books titled Boundaries and Belonging: Rehabilitating Refugees in India 1947 to 1971. The subject that she has taken today, the partition machinery, is important also because not so much historical research has been done on this subject. Uh, Much of the research on the subject of partition has been done on the tragedy of partition, the violence, the human tragedy, and the emotions involved, which is very natural because it was a human tragedy, and millions of people were affected by it, and therefore it is quite understandable that journalists, historians, political scientists, they have all focused on that human aspect of it. However, there was an entire bureaucratic effort involved in actually what is called effecting the partition. Once the decision to partition the country was made by the British and accepted by the International Congress, at several levels, the official machinery uh, had to be in place in order to really carry out the 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 divisions, the partitions, the settlements of things. This could, of course, land was one, but settlement uh, of various, for example, records of various kinds. They too had to be divided. Assets of all kinds, tangible assets of the state, they had to be divided. The treasury had to be divided in a certain proportion, and similarly bureaucracy itself obviously became a divided house because uh, many people chose to go over to Pakistan. And of course, a very complex division that took place was that of the Indian Army. So a lot of work was required in this. So one side of the work was the taking care of the refugees, the 9 million refugees. That is one which has already been paid a lot of attention. But the other side is this, the in which the officialdom was involved in actually making the slate clean. you know so that part, I think, is going to be highlighted by Pallavi today in her talk. And I believe that her focus is going to be not on the top level officials, from what I understand, but on the middle level officials, how they contributed to sort of effecting all these things which were important for for the partition. And we know about, of course, the Partition Council, which provided the political leadership to the nation uh, once the decision was taken. And the Partition Council, as we know, was the apex council. It was headed by Lord Mountbatten, and it had, I think, Dr. Rajendra Prasad and Sardar Patel from the Indian side, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Abdul Rab Nishtar, Sardar Nishtar, isn't it? Oh, no, sorry, Liaquat Ali and Sardar Abdul Rab Nishtar from the Pakistani side. But below this, there was, a official committee which was described as the steering committee. And of course, then the steering committee had subcommittees which focused on the actual task of taking evidence from people, making stock of all assets, etc., and dividing them in a certain proportion. So that administrative and bureaucratic effort, uh, meticulous as it was, I believe is going to be the focus of Pallavi's talk today. So I do not want to preempt her lecture in any manner whatsoever. So with these few words now, I would like to invite Dr. Pallavi Chakravarty to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you, sir, for such a kind introduction, and also
I would request if you can speak a bit louder.
is it clear now?
Yeah.
Am I heard? Thank you, sir, for this kind introduction, and in many ways summarizing the paper also in the way you always do. Always an honor to speak at Nehru Library. And as the title suggests, as sir has already mentioned, so I will be looking into the partition machinery. Now, it's a very large task that was left for the bureaucrats to do. So the whole project over here, of course, looks into all the aspects, which some of them which sir has told, and which I will also be pointing out in some of the slides over here. But this specific paper is looking into the focusing especially on the division of the official staff and the personals, administrative personals, the civilians. At some stage, and I hope in the whole process of this project at Nehru Library, I will be able to cover the aspect of division of the army as well as some institutions which were termed as unique and how to share, so tangible and the human aspect as well as institutions. At the same time, I will also look into this is up to 1940, August 15th, August 1947. What I also plan to think include would be the aspect of the relief workers. So the bureaucrats, how they functioned up to 15th of August, and thereafter taken over by the relief workers, how they gave the soothing element of to the refugees. Yeah. So the objectives, I mean, that's what I've tried to summarize, is of this whole project is to look into these unsung heroes as well as the unsung women of partition who have left behind large number of autobiographies and biographies as well as in their own vast papers, but somehow they have not been discussed to a great extent. They have been used in either discussing the high politics of partition, or their works have been used to discuss the refugee politics. But to make them the center focus is what my project, the larger project at Nehru Library, looks at, the bureaucrats and the relief workers. But today's paper is specifically looking into the bureaucrats and how they decided dividing the civilian personnel in the course of this partition machinery. A little bit of historiographical context would help here to place my work where it is coming in. From a long point of time, the works were essentially about the Indian national movement and was, of course, a very hard-fought independence, pioneering in many ways, which led to a lot of further independence movements in other countries as well. So the focus remained on that, in which partition was almost like a footnote, or at max seen as an anomaly, or seen as well, a small price paid for the larger idea of gaining independence. So large number of works actually focused on that, and partition remained marginal. Somewhere from the 1960s, we started seeing what is the how and why questions. Ashim Roy has very rightly termed those works as the high politics of partition. So this was a result of autobiographies, memoirs, biographies being written and commissioned by the first hand participants, as Professor Sucheta Mahajan calls, the participant narratives. So those works were there, but at the same time, one also saw that scholarly works as well started coming out from England, from India, from Pakistan, and largely those works in the 60s and 70s looked at who is to be blamed for partition. So when the focus came also on partition, it was more about how this happened or who is to be blamed, and based upon your nationality, biases emerged. So that was the next major works on partition in partition studies. And so from 1980s there came a change whereby this high politics was uh, to some extent forgotten, and what became more important is the meaning of partition. What It's not important to know who is to be blamed and who was responsible for this divide, but rather to look at what it actually meant on the ground. So the refugees, so all the studies of violence, what partition meant, as Gyanendra Pandey has mentioned, partition was just about violence. Of course, the focus was on Punjab, so that's how it is violence. Works on Bengal started looking at it, also meant uprooting, it meant nostalgia. So the meaning of partition, that is something which came across from the works of Professor Gyanendra Pandey, Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, etc. They started talking about that we need to know what's the meaning of partition. And from the 2000s, we see again a new turn that has come, which is going back to the politics in a way, especially with the work, The Term Long Partition, as the title of Wazira Zamindar's book talks about, that it's okay, we have now understood what the meaning of partition was, but we need to see what its long-term implications were. And in many ways, then it has gone into, of course, refugee politics. But so once again, coming to the politics, but now the politics somewhere from below. So Joya Chatterjee, Wazira Zamindar, Niti Nair, so many of these works who are looking at the long-term effect of partition, of that divide, and the divide in the cognitive minds, how it is affecting, the South Asian, the region itself. Somewhere over here, and in now, in all these phases of partition studies, some kind of limitations can be noticed, that focus was either on high politics or from politics from below. This middle tier, this is a term used by Yakub Bangash, and I will be discussing his work also. Middle ground, which I'm trying to look into, this middle ground of people who were involved in the process of decision making, or even in terms of decision making with respect to how to carry out partition, or also with respect to how to provide relief to the refugees, their role has been missing. So, whether you look at politics from above or below, it's the middle ground that the works have been very few and far in between. Also, when we are looking at the politics of partition, whether high politics or refugee politics, it's an image of chaos and anarchy which is being dominating. So, the mass violence, mass uprooting, disruption, and everything is chaotic. If one looks into the middle ground, somewhere one can also sense that there was some sort of semblance of order which was being tried to be achieved. I hope the paper towards the end will give a hint towards this, and that's what the intention is over here. That it's not all chaotic. It's not. I mean, of course, it's genocidal proportion violence that we see, but there were people. There were some sincere efforts being made to try to make this much more smoother. After all, the biggest evidence is that on the eve of 14th and 15th August, you did have two fully functioning governments in place celebrating their Independence Day. So that is where the contribution of the middle ground becomes important. And lastly, what a study of the middle ground and the negotiations and their deliberations also shows is that even in a period of high conflict, there could be possibilities of compromise, there could be possibilities of cooperation. And so it could be like a lesson for future, and some things which come across from H.M. Patel's work that I will be quoting here shows that this is really what the future generations can see, that even when there was a lot of conflict and very high passions, yet there were some people who were trying to be together and sort out differences, and iron out the differences which were there. My sources are, of course, all oral history archives, which is there at Nehru Library, and there are a large number of autobiographies and biographies left behind of the civil servants, the relief workers, but here I'm focusing on the civil servants only. Private papers have been very useful, again in Nehru Library, which are there, which give us an idea of the feelings, etc. And contemporary newspapers have been very useful to point out the grievances, even in the problems that come across from the partition machinery and their decisions. Let me discuss now what is this partition machinery. This term comes from a memo which was tabled by Viceroy Mountbatten on 2nd of June 1947 and termed as Administrative Consequences of Partition. So it was something very new for our leading politicians to see, something which Mountbatten has noted, but also something which the civil servants present at that time, H.M. Patel, B.K. Nehru, they also said it was like a shock for Jinnah, for Nehru, for Patel, to actually see what is this administrative consequences. So political rhetoric, we have been fighting for a separate state, or we have been asking for a Pakistan, but what it actually meant is something which was tabled by Mountbatten on 2nd of June, just before the 3rd June partition plan was announced. And it was very clear that the politicians were simply taken aback that this is what we have to do now. And that's where the importance of the civil servants again became important. I want to quote here Jenkins, even Jenkins, who was the governor of Punjab, very clearly he mentioned in relation to discussing this administrative consequences. The politicians would be well advised to leave the matter in my hands. The politicians did not realize yet what they are in for, and my difficulty would be to get them in business seriously and to undertake the really arduous task which it involves. Uh, which means that here onwards, rhetoric had been, a portion is over. Now it is about action, and that's where the civil servants had to take over. Organizational consequences, likewise, is a term which comes across in the emergency cabinet committee meetings, which were held all through from the period of June right up to the early months of 1948. And this term actually was used over there to speak about that when we divide the country, the functioning of the different various departments, government departments, should not be hampered. And so what can happen, that is termed as organizational consequences of partition. So these are really where, and this is a slide which just shows you what were the points which Mountbatten and his team had presented as administrative consequences of partition. Looking into all the 9 points, one can see that apart from point 8, which is determination of domicile, none of them actually looked into the human factor of partition. Division of forces, division of civilians. So government servants, they are the ones who are coming up in this whole administrative consequences. But really what happens to the people is sought to be thought in this point within determination of domicile. And if I may say over here, then it's still I'm researching on this, but the department which looked into domicile was the first to submit its report, and they said that people will stay where they are, they don't lose their domicile. And so they nobody really imagined that there will be this mass migration which is going to actually affect aspects of domicile, citizenship, etc. So this is of course what Mountbatten had envisioned, that we need to therefore set up, and that's where the term partition machinery comes across, that to discuss into all these points, we need to have a partition machinery. Let us look into what the partition machinery comprised of. The partition machinery, it was decided, would have the partition committee. Later on, post 15th August, it became the partition council. As already mentioned by Sir over here, it did comprise of 2 members from Congress, 2 members from the Muslim League. Additionally, when this was constituted, one thing was emphasized, that these are the leaders upon whom they're going to be the final source of final authority on all decisions. Because 2 things were emphasized by Mountbatten. That one is that there is very little time. Obviously, if you calculate from 2nd June to 15th August, it's almost 72 days. We have very little time. We don't want to go back and fro in our decisions. So select that those people upon whom you have maximum trust. And so naturally, these were the options which came across. Below the partition council was the steering committee, and the actual work of dividing was on these 2 ICS officers, H.M. Patel and Muhammad Ali. H.M. Patel also eventually went on to become a cabinet minister rank in in the government of India, and Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, of course, went on to even become the prime minister of Pakistan. But at this time, they are here as the highest civil servants. Logic of partition being one: Hindu to represent India, Muslim to represent the state of Pakistan. All decisions actually came up from here. They were the liaising officers between the Partition Council, the Steering Committee, and the 10 expert committees. The 10 expert committees were comprising again of civil service officers, or you had senior government officials or subject experts, and they were discussing. These are the 10 expert committees. As you can see, almost similar to the administrative consequences, the points raised over there. Each of these comprised again in equal number two Hindus, two Muslims, and they had before them the entire data of the various departments. They were supposed to over here discuss how to divide, the various under their respective heads, how to divide the process. There was going to be, a lot of deliberations and, sort of arguments, very passionately fought. The decisions of expert committees would go to the steering committee. Steering committee would take it to the partition council, and as I have seen, and I mean, all these decisions are recorded in what is called as partition proceedings. You have a series of partition proceedings 1 to 6. All of them show that there are expert committee recommendations, the debates which were there. Then you have the steering committee which decides and tries to find out a middle ground. It goes to the partition council. On very rare occasion, there is a detailed note by the partition council. Largely, the argument is that the recommendations of steering committee hold true. So you can see in many ways the steering committee was a very decisive factor. And fortunately, H.M. Patel has his own sort of memoirs, rites of passage. A lot of the decisions and lot of what were the sticky points comes across from that very book itself, and of course, reading through partition proceedings. Just to again tell, this paper is looking at expert committee one, because that is the one which dealt with the division of the civilian government staff. And of course, it had other issues also, like this division of important institutions, etc. And eventually, I will also be looking at the deliberations of expert committee 10, which is the armed forces and the division of the army. So my focus for this paper specifically is on the division of the civilian officials, and that is what this current slide talks about. Now, deliberations were, which one can see is right in the constitution of the expert committee, the terms of reference. And then you also had a lot of deliberations and arguments within those expert committees. To just give us some hint of, an example of the kind of deliberations within the expert committees, the first thing, the sticky point was that is it a division or division of India, or is a part of India being seceded? Now, Jinnah is of the view that it is India which is dividing, so the whole idea of India gets, is rubbed out, and it's a new India and a new Pakistan. H.M. Patel says it's not, and that's the belief of Nehru as well, that it's India which was always there, and there's a part in terms of Pakistan which is seceding out of it. So in the very terminologies itself, you had first, point of conflict. So will it be division or secession? That also somehow got sorted out in terms of, and this is where, the role of the civil servants becomes important because they have been working together with each other, this level of camaraderie that was there, the level of trust that was there. They were very much sure that the Muslim representations wanted the best for Pakistan, and the Hindus were wanting the best for India. But at the same time, there was also a level of compromise which they were willing to reach. Another example of, the debates within the expert committee would be that should then the physical assets be divided. How, for example, there are very interesting anecdotes on division of the National Library. It was Imperial Library then, and now it's National Library Calcutta. How to divide this institution, or for example, the National Archives, Imperial Archives at that time. How does one, who will get all the records? So in that also, then the compromise came that we will, duplicate the records of which are there in the National Archives, whichever there will be full indexes which will be shared, and thereafter you duplicate the records. And so what I'm trying to say is that through all these small anecdotal references also, one gets to see that the main aim is that let us get the job done. We don't want to stop. We have 70 days. We want to finish the process of division. And so what one is seeing is, as very rightly pointed out in the interview of H.M. Patel, that lack of ill will doesn't mean there was goodwill. So it's not that we were all happy about each other, but we were very sure that we want to get this work completed. So we were willing to go the extra mile towards compromise. So this is deliberation regarding Constitutional Expert Committee itself. As one can see, there are debates which come across. Coming now to the division of personnels, this is the ruling dictate that was given that each government servant will have the opportunity to select the place that he wishes to serve. And accordingly, the government would make arrangements for the transfer. So if you are a Muslim and you will choose Pakistan and you're based in India, the government of Pakistan was going to arrange for your uh, transfer. This is a special transfer office which comes up at this time, based in the North Block in Delhi, with the officials, representing government of Pakistan. As you can see, there are some uh, essential tasks which were given and which they were responsible for: arrangement of transport, then also about families. So government officials to shift with their families. There was some time given that maybe immediately, as you see, the capital of Pakistan at that time was Karachi, which was a sleepy port town, not really used to the idea of becoming a national capital. There was a lot of work which was required to make Karachi, be able to accommodate these officials. So some sort of, that's where transfer office became important, that it would be the intermediary. The officials can go, the families can stay back. In the meanwhile, the transfer office is liaising with the government of India on how to pay back and retain this accommodation. So the grade of transport, some officials entitled to airfare, just like a normal, it was treated as a normal transfer. So airfare for some, reserved compartments for some. One thing that does definitely come across, and that was my PhD book research that I looked at, that government officials definitely became the more privileged category among the refugees, because they got a very assured and safe transit in most cases. And also they got assured jobs. So for them, it was like a regular transfer that had happened. Of course, there are element of nostalgia, leaving behind, way of life of home was there. But among the general mass of refugees, they were then a privileged lot. And so this is the task which the transfer office had. Now, how were the people divided? As I said, that the wish and the individual choice was important. In that context, gazetted officers were given option forms and they had to choose, very interestingly, India final or India provisional, Pakistan final or Pakistan provisional. If you chose a provisional option or even final option, you had the option to change your this chosen option within 6 months of time. That it became problematic is also something which I will be coming towards in the grievances, but technically, on paper, one did have a chance. So some level of fluidity was allowed to the government official, that you can think over after going and you want to come back. But coming back became very difficult also. That is also something which is there. Non-gazetted officers were not really, I mean, they also had the option to choose, but it was not through a form. It's something that your committee was made, they gave. And theirs was a transfer which was much more staggered. It was imagined that it should not be, instant. You needed the senior higher government officials to quickly take the positions which were being vacant or which were being created in the new governments. But the more numerous of the non-gazetted officers, they you had to find adequate jobs for them. You also had to ensure that the job that they were doing, for example, in the police, the constables, sub inspectors, one expected that the person is very, it's violence, the Punjab violence that's going on at this time. If you en masse they allow them to, choose their option and leave, because Punjab had a majority of Muslim in the police department also. If they all leave, then what happens to the maintenance of law and order? So for that purpose, it was thought that let them have a more staggered or phase wise transfer and not an immediate transfer that was there. This is an option form. Again, it's taken from the partition proceeding. So you can see the option that is given to the each government official. GD Khosla papers in Nehru Library, of course, has a full collection of the data of such options on the Indian side. I don't have access to, of course, the other side of such option form, but that was very useful for me to even tabulate and see different departments. And what I saw, I mean, this is the uh, tabulation which was there in the GD Khosla papers that I found. What was very clearly visible that class 1 officers all immediately chose, based on their religion. Very few exceptions were there, including the Delhi police commissioner who chose to stay in India. He was a Muslim, but he chose to stay here. And there are some more examples. Anis Kidwai, her husband, also, of course, who was then shot and killed by the refugees on duty in Shimla. So there were people who chose, even Muslims who chose and opted to stay on in India. But largely, the higher ranking officials opted for Pakistan. Class 3 and class 4 are the ones where you can see there is a level of indecisiveness. Just for, as I was telling, the reason is that maybe they are in surplus, maybe they will not all get jobs in Pakistan, and perhaps they also did not have what we call mobility capital to just move away and shift. So that I will of course come to the analysis part. This is just to say, so while you had all these option forms and every of these departments had to submit this form had to be submitted by 24th of July. Extension was given to the army first week of August, and also the larger departments like railways, posts, and telegraphs. They had a little, as you can see, 2 months extension that was given to them. Exception was also given to those options, those people who had, who are important. For example, as I was saying, the local police officials who are, position. For them also, it was decided that don't shift them immediately. They know the place better, that they have a better hold and they can control the violence over there. There was also exception given to some cases, as to incentivize them, that new options are there. So 20% additional pay would be given if you take these new departments. And finally, the fourth point is of those exceptional cases where people just opted for either option. So they were okay. And this, you can see some examples would be, of course, of the British civil servants. They were okay wherever, better remuneration or options. I can go to India or Pakistan. And one interesting case has been pointed out by Yakub Bangash in his work, where he talks of Indian Christians. So those civil servants, and one very famous, renowned civil servant is Mangat Rai, an Indian Christian. He also initially opted either, but then of course he chose India. So that option were also there. Those are also some exception cases which were there. So this is discussing the partition machinery, what it was and what its task was. I now come to some things that we can observe in this whole process of dividing what comes across. Obviously, religion seemed to be the most important factor. As I was saying, if you go through the choices and options, it was very clear. Senior officials, Hindus and Sikhs all chose India. Muslims all chose Pakistan. Why they chose Pakistan in the very higher echelons is something which I pointed out. Influence under the notion of a promised land. Now here Badruddin Tayyabji, again civil servant himself, in his memoirs talks about that there was a sort of internal hierarchy within the civil services. Those who appeared in the London exams, those who appeared in the Indian exams, the people who appeared in London saw themselves far more superior. 2 years of probation, also, they had only 1 year of probation. Those who appeared from India and cleared it, they had 2 years of probation. And in this, the third category was of the nominated civil servants. And what he found, his observation is that mostly the Muslim civil servants came from the nominated category. He takes pride in himself being one of those few who actually cleared the civil services. So he said that there was always a sort of complex, there was a sort of feeling of subordination to the Hindus. This same thought of feeling of subordination, not only in the civil services but even in general, is something I've found in the CID report here, which I've cited over here, that there is a feeling that there is Hindu domination in the jobs, and Pakistan, therefore, for us is a place where we can finally have I don't know the more aspirational value for some of these officers. Though that's the reason when most of the class one officers choose. And very rightly, if one sees the trajectory of Pakistan, a lot of civil servants, military bureaucrats really reached very high positions over there. But on the other side, if we see now some drawbacks in this whole process, one thing which comes out is not everything was, as I said, choice was not really the factor. This quotation is from Anis Kidwai's Azadi Ki Chhaon Mein. I found it very powerful, which talks about that, यही हाल हर महकमे के मुलाजिमों का हुआ, जिन्होंने पाकिस्तान भी लिखा वह भी गए, जिन्होंने हिंदुस्तान लिखा वह भी भगा भगा दिए गए. As she thinks of her own husband, but she's also thinking of many other examples that shows that, and Wazira Zamindar's work, The Long Partition, in detail talks about this, of how it just became difficult for many of the people to stay on. So one had to be pushed back. Okay.
We'll come to discussion.
The other issues that one sees over here is provisional option, which was there, that was also not being honored. In fact, some examples said that first option should be given to those who opted for uh, who opted for India final first, then only you give uh, chances to those who opted for India provisional. So that is also something which is seen, especially in the army. It was very clearly said that it has to be religion based. So once you have opted for Pakistan, there is no way that you are supposed to, you can come back. So even though there was the 6 months option which was there, often it was not honored. Then the question of surplus. I give here an example of Pakistan, which is refusing to take in because, well, we have too many 600 mint workers opting. We have option only for 200 people. So in many cases, one did not even get back the job in that case. The main drawback, of course, is in the law and order situation. I found very interesting examples of Delhi police officials who were going away with in uniform with their arms and licensed revolvers. So often they were arrested and brought back. So this sort of thing also happened once you have the question of transfer is happening. People are leaving and they're going with their licensed revolvers. There's also it led to the biased administration in many cases. As I said, the deputy commissioner becomes more powerful. This is something which is cited in Wazir Zamindar's work as well, than the commissioner, chief of commissioner himself. Mm, there would be a citation, but I think I'm running a little out of time. So it becomes, and another thing that one sees because of this law and order situation is also that there are instances of people actually in the high official participating in this whole loot and plunder. The example I have pointed out in the slide is related to Sultanpur, but there's also an example from Punjab where you have the chief minister reporting that the chief commissioner and the SSP, they are also involved in looting and plundering and taking some sort of bribe for safe passage. So these also drawbacks do come across, and that is part of then the grievances that, as I said, there were the grievance of surplus, sometimes provisional option which was not being honored, sometimes final option also not being honored because of regional issues. So Assam, for example, did not want to take in all the East Pakistan government servants who had actually opted for Assam, saying we are full. So this was one example that I did find over here. This grievance with respect to the policy, with the actual process of transfer too, we find there are grievances coming across as this is coming from the newspaper that Dawn, that you can see very clearly. People are in a state of anxiety. They feel that in the we are not being able to understand the process of transfer, or the accommodation is not enough. Married staff, for example, they are in dilemma whether we will get a home or not. This kind of grievances also which comes across. So apart from the machinery, the process of partitioning, and then the grievances, it's the impact that I think which will come across works of Anvesha Sengupta, Yakub Bangash, and very recently Pallavi Raghavan has also showed in her work that looking into this role of the bureaucrats and this middle ground of partition, one thing can be seen that you had what they emphasize on the cooperation aspect. They also talk about how there was some kind of semblance of order which was ensured the place would be there. For example, as I said, on 14th, 15th August, you did have the two governments fully functioning after all. So not true as British would like to show that we got India in a place of chaos and now we left it also in a place of chaos. It's the long-term lessons which are very worthwhile to, if I can quote over here H.M. Patel, one wishes fondly for that kind of spirit. If it was possible to generate it then in the midst of a period of great tension, it could perhaps have been generated once again to help in the solution of problems that plague our two countries today. So it was hoped that uh, this level of cooperation would be maintained. Of course, the Kashmir issue and then the three wars have, completely shown that it's not really possible. But one can think that, even in point of high conflict, there was some kind of negotiations and compromise between the two sides, which worked out to make the transfer place much more smoother, the transfer process much more smoother. And it's with this last quotation from again from H.M. Patel that I would like to end, which talks about the role, the very important role of the partition committee, and how the individuals over here really worked hard to ensure that by the end of 15th August, you really had two governments which were functioning, and in many ways they tried to uh, iron out the differences between the two conflicting states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pallavi, for a very, very insightful lecture on this subject. We are now open to questions and brief comments. Yes, please come up and use the mic. Use the mic.
मैम मेरा क्वेश्चन आपने जो बताया काफ़ी डिटेल में बताया मतलब कि गजेटेड ऑफिसर नॉन गजेटेड ऑफिसर के बारे में जो उनका ट्रांसफर हो रहा है मगर वहीं हम जैसे कि आईआरडी की बात करते हैं इंपीरियल रिकॉर्ड डिपार्टमेंट की बात करते हैं उनके रिकॉर्ड्स का ट्रांसफर आपने बताया कि कॉपीज जो है पाकिस्तान ने ले ली तो एक क्वेश्चन तो ये कि कॉपीज जैसे कि मैं जो मुझे लगता है 2 से 3 कॉपी तैयार होती थी जैसे कि मुंबई रिकॉर्ड डिपार्टमेंट होती थी जो बाद में कलकत्ता ट्रांसफर हुई तो क्या हमने ओरिजिनल कॉपीज इनको दी थी अगर ओरिजिनल कॉपीज नहीं दी थी तो क्या पाकिस्तान सहमत हो गया था इस बात पर कि हम कॉपीज को एक्सेप्ट कर लेंगे
We'll take up other questions also. Yes, please go ahead.
यह किदवई का हिंदी में था कि जिन्होंने हिंदुस्तान लिखा वो भी उनको भी गया पाकिस्तान जाने के वो समझ नहीं आया कि जो ये लिखा और वो लिखा वो भी उनको
all right yes, Soumya, go ahead.
Thank you, Pallavi. That was very clear, very lucid, and very insightful, as sir said. I'm sure you're looking at it, but this process of the coming and going also got entangled later on in matters of evacuee property. And I would like you to comment slightly because the fall between or the gap between good intentions of making things work and the way that did not work. It comes across through your presentation also, where you have the option form, you have the provisional option form, but we all know that especially members from the police department, from the CID, and many other government departments were actually not allowed to stay back or in both countries. If you wrote provisional or even if you wrote final, it was not happening. And the long battles that many of the people would have to then fight for the option to stay in India, and because their properties are all labeled as evacuee property. So if you would like to just get that in, it would be nice. Thank you.
Any other question? Yes, go ahead, Riddhi.
Thank you, Pallavi, for a great talk. You've emphasized the functionalities that kept the two governments functioning and going, with the partition and so on. Is there any instance of something that we have inherited from the partition machinery that is the dysfunctionalities, so to speak, that have lingered on in the current nation states as well? Thank you.
Yes, I think you.
I just have one question to add.
Okay.
You've presented a very, very detailed account of what happened, and it's very impressive the kind of work that you have done. My only query is, does it seem a very sanitized version of actually the chaos and the confusion that happened? Because listening to you, I marvel at the intricacies that you've gone into it. But that blood and sweat and the tears, they seem to be missing. Why are you laughing? They seem to be missing in your account.
No, if I may, actually, you know that in the introduction itself, I said that the focus of the studies, as far as partition is concerned, has been on the tragedy, human tragedy, and quite naturally, because millions of people suffered. But obviously, she has done something which is different, and probably there is a need for that also. Now, I think let her answer now, because there are a few questions. You can.
A mute point in terms of the logic of this entire story, because as we know, every event would have stories and there are narratives which revolve around those stories, and then there are different versions of what exactly happened. So you are telling us one part of it, and which we really appreciate, and at the same time what ma'am is saying, what is the purpose of telling the smoother parts of this partition story? Because as ordinary citizens, as people who are interested in knowing about the past of partition, we know about the story of blood and sweat. Telling us about something which was smoother and which might not even probably happen as it was meant to be eventually, as Samya pointed out. So what is the purpose of this smooth or middle ground, if the term that you're using? What is the purpose of this middle ground? Because it seems it was politics of convenience of civil servants. They were anyways in position of power, and they created a safe passage for themselves, which eventually, and then their stories become so grave eventually because they were in power. So that's it.
Yes, go ahead. You can just be brief. Huh?
One is about the division of records, which you've asked. So it was very contested, and in fact, in many ways, it will also answer the question asked over here, that there are many debates which are going. What I have presented is the final point, which is emerging, right? The final decision. But to arrive at this decision, there is a lot of, passionate fighting within the committee, which is there. And I can cite those also, where there are examples of, why India should get everything, why it should not be, come to Pakistan, why the records should not be there. So it is not, but then, as I was saying, the main thing that is being emphasized is that we need to have this apparatus in place by 15th August. So whatever level of compromise happens is because they have this thing in mind, that we need to keep the two governments at least functioning. And so where there is a lot of violence which is going on the ground, yet at that point we are seeing that Central Partition Commission, it is a very sanitized, environment. You're sitting in Delhi and, deliberating over the division, which it's Punjab which is burning. But in many ways, that is the reason that there would be arguments, but ultimately one agreed to it. So imperial records were divided. To many things were seen in terms of what is useful for Pakistan, very, very strange kind of documents which they felt is useful for us. They took on very flimsy grounds, just because it mentioned regions of Pakistan, of the probable Pakistan. Some of those records went in original, but then it was agreed that there will always be a, whichever you need, India needs or Pakistan needs, you will always have the option of copying that record and keeping. Now, many records got lost. That is also the truth in behind this whole process, and that's a loss for researchers also. But at that time, it was, on a mutual terms, which was agreed that certain records we are going to have the indexes and find out which one to keep for Pakistan. It would be very flimsy grounds and very hotly fought over. But that's how it was then ultimately divided also. And the Skidway option is that she's talking about the Muslims. So even those who opted for Pakistan left, and those who opted for India also were pushed out. How they were pushed out is, through nudges, not very apparently, not put across very clearly that you have to leave. But for example, in the army, you were not going to recruit. So you, even if you opt, it was a dictate that Muslims need to opt for Pakistan and Hindus over here. So that is the thing what she's trying to point out. So that is why it was very, very powerful in that way, that you have an option which has been planned, but then on the ground, it's not actually being affected. Regarding evacuee property, Wazira Zamindar has worked so much in detail, and even my also PhD research looked in many ways about the whole process, how evacuee property slips, and that bureaucracy also has been discussed. But for this work, I'm not really looking into that aspect because it doesn't come within really the framework of the decisions which partition. As I said, that in all those 9 consequences, people are not really mattered. They only mattered in the aspect of domicile. They, yes, yes, and they were wrong in that because that never happened. People did move across. So that's what those are the shortcomings, as I also pointed out. So not everything was covered, and what was immediately required for the functioning of the two governments. That is what this partition machinery was looking at. So it's not that they covered everything, and therefore you can see in those 9 expert committees nothing about refugees. Nobody imagined. So if the politicians did not imagine the administrative consequences, our bureaucrats did not imagine the consequences of the partition on the people. So despite the fact that violence has started in Punjab, movement has already started between the two places. So there are shortcomings. So that then brings me to your thing that why are we looking at it? As I quoted, and that's why I put that quotation also over there, and I cited also Patel, that these are very troubled times. So at some time, then, for example, there are works which look at what are the positives. We look at refugee women. Mostly works were all about abduction, violence that they suffer. Then recently, Pallavi Chakravarty and Yashodhara Bagchi, they came across with the concept of the coming out of refugee women. That there was a negative part, and nobody can deny that the violence and but there was also the aspect of these women standing up on their own. So in partition studies, it is a sort of thing that you are looking and nobody's denying the violence. But why not look into some aspects which have an idea of that there was possibility of some order, and largely it is to deny the system. When the expert committees were set up, the vision that Mountbatten said Indians will be there on all the committees except defense, which will have, of course, it had the chief of army staff in it. So Mountbatten is at pains to show that this mess is created by you. You have done all this, and Indian politicians. So he felt that it will not succeed. But the committees came up, they divided, and that process, and there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, but you had the two governments functioning. So you're giving a lie to the argument that it was that the Indians could not manage it. So that is one reason why some of the works have now started looking into the process. And then, of course, we look in the past, and as I gave the historiographical context to discuss why partition or what after partition. why not also look in what was happening during partition? So that is where I would like to place my focus.
Any other questions?
Violence was not only Punjab, but it started in Bengal as well.
Yes, yes, and a different kind of violence. Yes, different kind of.
हाँ शुक्ला जी.
बहुत अच्छा टॉक पल्लवी, और आपने एक फ्रेमवर्क खींचा और उस फ्रेमवर्क में रही, तो कैसे टॉक दिया जाता है, कैसे प्रिपेयर किया जाता है, ये भी सीखना चाहिए. और आपने नेहरू मेमोरियल के रिसोर्सेज को बहुत अच्छे से यूज किया है, ये बहुत अच्छी बात है, तो इसके लिए आपको बधाई. एक जगह पर आप बता रहे थे कि जो है जो स्टीयरिंग कमेटीज हैं, सब कमेटी में हैं, उसमें हिंदूज हैं, मुस्लिम्स हैं. तो ये जो हिंदू और मुस्लिम का डिवाइडेशन, क्योंकि हम पहले देख रहे हैं जब पार्टीशन की टॉक चल रही है, तो कांग्रेस की तरफ से मुसलमान है, क्योंकि वो ये नहीं दिखाना चाहता है कि इंडिया अकेले हिंदुओं की पार्टी है या कांग्रेस हिंदुओं की पार्टी है. लेकिन जब ये बन रही हैं कमेटी, तो उसमें हिंदू मुस्लिम का डिवाइड एकदम साफ दिख रहा है, ऐसा आपका टॉक. तो ये कुछ खास कोई चीज ऐसी जो इस तरह का क्यों ऐसा हुआ? क्योंकि अगर शायद दोनों तरफ दोनों लोग होते, तो शायद ये जो ह्यूमन प्रॉब्लम्स आई हैं उसमें थोड़ा सा अंतर आ सकता था. लेकिन पाकिस्तान की तरफ से सोचा जा रहा, इंडिया की तरफ से जो लोग पॉलिटिशियंस थे, जो लोग तय करने वाले थे कि कमिटीज में कौन, तो उन्होंने मुसलमानों को क्यों नहीं डाला? ये एक छोटा सा सोचने की बात थी, अगर आपने कभी सोचा हो इस बारे में. तो
Very, very valuable point, sir. Thank you for this. And I'm just trying to think of all the names that's coming to my mind. So this is something one needs to think is why Hindus only were there in expert committee. So I will have to check, sir, because I think there would have been. Normally it was Hindus and steering committee very clearly Hindu is representing India, but within the committees it's possible that there would have been in the Indian side some Muslims, and I will keep an account.
Any other question? You have in a very precise manner traced out the historiography of partition. You said that in the first decade or so, partition was treated as a mere footnote of independence, except by those obviously who had suffered. So for them, it is the suffering of the partition which was much more real than independence. But I agree with you that for most people, it was the joy of independence which was much more important. And therefore, quite naturally, the attention of the society was not focused on the partition, but on independence, on building a new India. That was the idea behind it. And then in the second stage, it is the blame game that is started. So you know that the famous book written by Ram Manohar Lohia, The Guilty Men of Partition. So you see, this was not history. This was not history writing. Partition was being seen as a crime, and it was being seen as a crime, and responsibility was being fixed. So that human side, of the nationalists also looking at why partition happened despite our best efforts, then that became the second, focus of analysis. And then, of course, the image of partition as chaos, it continued to be there. And in the next stage, then it's like what it meant, the meaning of partition, that became the focus of attention. So in a way, actually, it is all like an individual would look at something. In the first stage, you are under shock. So whatever good is there, you enjoy it. Then after that joy of having achieved independence or whatever is over, then you try to look for the causes of defeat. So blame game. And then you obviously see the chaos involved, and then you come to the meaning of things, isn't it? So you see that there is a strange similarity here between the human individual way of thinking about life and the country looking at partition. And I believe the reason is precisely because partition was such a great human tragedy that naturally we we could think about it and we could apply analytical frameworks and categories which were similar to the human way of thinking about such events and such tragedies. So probably it's not about sort of blaming the scholars or historians, but the point is that this is the only logical way something as big as this could have been studied over the decades, because once you have settled down, only then can you try to engage with the meaning of something as big as partition. I mean, a country that had existed for thousands of years, and then a nation state which was there, and of course even the British India had been there for 200 years, and then all of a sudden they were separated from each other. So it was incomprehensible. In fact, as you know, that Rahi Masoom Raza has written that novel, famous novel Adha Gaon. I'm sure you would have read. And there you find the stories of how local people could not understand what Pakistan meant. How could they? Because they were not conversant with the category of sovereignty. They could not understand that partition meant, I mean, I'm talking about illiterate people, they could not understand that partition meant the creation of a sovereign state to which you will not be able to go freely and come back. In fact, some of them imagined that their village will be partitioned into two, and one side will be India and another side will be Pakistan. Now that brings me to the question of, very interesting point that you made there, that as far as gazetted officers were concerned, senior officials were concerned, almost all Muslim officials automatically opted for Pakistan. And one factor, of course, was there. They shrewdly calculated that since a new state is being created, obviously the chances of promotion and of occupying senior positions there would be much higher as compared to what they could get in India. And then, of course, they had their rivalries, as Tayyabji and others have said, and they thought that in India they were being dominated by the Hindus and others. So that also acted as something. But the other factor which played a very important role was, and you said that the staff at the lower level were indecisive. So in a way that also reflects the overall mentality of partition, which was guided by the Muslim elite actually. So I'm not at all surprised. What I'm trying to say is you have done a very good work, but what you are presenting in terms of facts and analysis generally fits into the larger understanding of partition. So in that way, the usefulness of what you have done is very, very high. So you see, because these meanings are coming out very clearly from your analysis. Why is it that the senior officials so easily chose? Because one, they were the ones who were the most communalized, who had this feeling that if they stay in India, their interests will not be taken care of and India will not be good enough for them. So automatically they opted for it. And of course, they had their, was what you described as this migration capital. So it was easy enough for them. They had their cosmopolitan links on the other side. They could easily shift. And of course, they were in senior positions anyway. So they could find all the support from the government as well. And it is the common people, the staff at the lower level, who had to suffer. There was no other sort of possibility in that kind of a situation for them. One point that I wanted to make, and probably you might respond to this also, was um, you talk about how the political leadership was taken aback when the administrative consequences of the partition were presented to them. What do you think was the reason? Was it that, we all have heard that Jinnah thought that he could still sort of come back to Bombay and live in his. And by the way, Jinnah built the big mansion in 1940 or so. So I don't know, but we hear these things. And then, of course, he was planning to take vacation in Kashmir. And similarly, other people may have thought, we don't know. But my point is this. Uh, we say that the political class was shocked by the administrative consequences when these were presented to them. So, what do you think was the reason? Could they not understand, both on the Congress side and Muslim League side, that what they were creating were two sovereign states, and their sovereignty meant sovereignty. After all, everything will have to be separated. You will become citizens of two totally separate countries with passports, visas, and everything. So, in these records, do you think that that understanding, if there are any discussions with the politicians, that understanding was somehow missing? What do you think was the reason that people thought like this?
Can I just make one point? This reassessment of Jinnah has been done by a scholar, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed. He has written a fantastic book
Yeah, recently.
which answers these questions. He knew what he was doing, and he has countered Aisha Jalal's theory that
Very effectively. Ishtiaq Ahmed has done it. In fact, Aisha Jalal's thesis was discredited long ago to say that Jinnah was simply using the demand of Pakistan as a bargaining counter is stretching history beyond everything. I mean, the man who gave the call for direct action day and who said that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together, who was willing to partition the country in at all costs, he cannot be absolved from that responsibility, as Aisha Jalal has said, and nor can the British be absolved from that responsibility. But it is, the specific thing that I'm trying to understand from her talk is this: uh, why is it that is it just that they had not thought about the administrative consequences, or they were too busy looking at the macro picture, or was there something else?
I am not going to attempt to answer this because a lot of it is even this idea that they were in shock comes from the memoirs of the civil servants, like B.K. Nehru himself tells that they were not they were inexperienced. This is something which comes that they were very good agitators. They were very good in fighting the freedom struggle, but when it came to administration, you had to rely on the civil services. That's one reason perhaps Nehru may not have been very keen on continuing with the civil services, but it's Sardar Patel who insisted that you need to keep the steel frame intact. So somewhere they felt they're inexperienced. H.M. Patel also tells that this was a task which could be done only by somebody who is impartial also. They felt that the civil services, all of their memoirs of our civil servants, they talk about the civil services being as apolitical as possible. And so somewhere now this impression that they were taken aback is coming from not from the memoirs of Nehru or Patel or anybody like that. It is coming from the civil service. So whether it was really there, that is also something we need to think about. But if it was there, is also one thing which comes across from all the oral histories of KPS men that I've gone through here on the Nehru Library, that yes, they were somewhere inexperienced. So they left it on the experts. So subject experts are there in every of these expert committees, they're established. So, but I will think a little bit more on this.
Yeah, probably this is something you can.
Yes, yes,
Go ahead.
yes, yes.
Pallavi, they were in 1980, they were volume.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, right.
In a way, your work seems to be going back
Mm-hmm.
to the kind of skill that it shifts you out. Like.
Right, right.
So in a way, from first stages,
Yes, yes.
slowly got people into the narrative.
Right, right.
Seems to be going back, and it's not sure. I can see that
Yes.
in terms of a lot of work that I have been graphic and
Yes,
video,
yes.
all of them are going back exactly
Yeah.
to the movement, the machinery as a way.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the shift? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
those are very detailed volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Transfer of volumes, and they dealt as well than away with this particular kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see your work as different? From it goes references or whatever from the kind of work that has been done by them.
Oh, but that's a collection of the documents. So it's just the raw data which is there. And we are using those now to analyze and interpret in the ways we want. Perhaps somebody earlier, everybody has used Mansfield volumes before, and they used it to show maybe Indian side of partition or bias based upon that. I'm using it to understand the machinery how it functioned, what
No, but those
benefits.
transfer of power volumes, they were written because the British wanted to show that we gave independence to India. We transferred power. There was no freedom struggle. That was the basic debate behind this. That we transferred power. India did not fight for her freedom.
That is absolutely no. But what Meenakshi ji is saying is absolutely correct. This was the British intention behind the publication of the transfer of power volumes, because you see the very word transfer of power. Of course, technically it was a transfer of power, but the fact is that Indians saw it as independence, and it was independence. It was independence, and Indians saw it as independence, and therefore to emphasize that it is the British who themselves gave it, these transfer of power volumes were brought out. You might recall that from the 1990s onward, there was a project towards freedom volumes, some of which came out, and many of the JNU historians were involved in it. And one of the reasons behind bringing this towards freedom was to counter the narrative that it was all, a British initiative, and it was a fulfillment of their rule, as they thought. Fulfillment of their rule was the transfer of power to Indians. So that narrative was also contested by towards freedom, and yes, yes. So your question when you say how is her analysis different from transfer of power, I think you are being a bit harsh on her. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. I got the impression you were asking how it is different. Anyway, obviously the same documents can be used for different ends, so there is nothing against using the transfer of power volumes. Yeah.
yes, yes. Yes.
Anyway, I think we have reached the end of the discussion. It has been a very, very good session, and I believe we all have enjoyed. So I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Pallavi Chakravarty and all members of the audience. And I would like to make an announcement on 15th of June at 3 p.m. Uh, I think I don't remember which day it is. There is a talk by Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council Chairman, Professor Vivek Debroy, uh, who is a well-known scholar. He's an economist, a scholar of Sanskrit who has translated the Mahabharata from Sanskrit. Very well-known economist and scholar, and he is going to speak to us on Indian economy in the post-COVID era. So please remember the date, and let's have tea. Thank you.